Section 1 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 1. There is not in this wide world a valley so sweet. One of Moore's sweetest effusions applies so well to our beautiful engraving this week that we cannot resist the temptation to give it a place in our pages as a pleasant accompaniment to the plate. There is not in this wide world a valley so sweet as the vale in whose bosom the bright waters meet. Oh, the last ray of feeling and life must depart, ere the bloom of that valley shall fade from my heart. Yet it was not that nature had shed o'er each scene her purest of crystal, her brightest of green. 'Twas not the soft magic of streamlet or rill. Oh, no, it was something more exquisite still. 'Twas that friends, the beloved of my bosom, were near, who made each fond scene of enchantment more dear, who felt how the blest charms of nature improve when we see them reflected with looks that we love. Sweet vale of Ovion, how calm could I rest in thy bosom of shade with the friends I love best, where the storms that we meet in this cold world should cease, and our hearts, like thy waters, be mingled in peace. End of section 1. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 2 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 2. The First Daughter of Eve, by Miss Elizabeth Oakes Smith. The soft, warm air scarcely stirred the leaves of the vine that clustered about the bower of Eve, as she lay with pale cheek and languid limbs, her first-born daughter resting upon her breast. Adam had led his sons to the field, that their sports might not disturb the repose of our first mother, and the low murmur of the tiny cascade, the monotonous hum of insects, and happy twitter of unfledged birds, all wooed her to slumber. Yet she slept not. She looked with a mother's deep, unutterable love upon the face of her babe, yet tears were in her eyes, and anxiety upon her brow. Herself the last, the perfection of the Creator's workmanship, she still marveled at the surprising beauty of her daughter. She looked into its dark liquid eyes, and drank deep from the fountain of maternal love. She pressed its small foot and hand to her lips, hugged it to her full heart, and felt again the bitterness of transgression. She thought of paradise, whence she had expelled her children. She thought of generations to come who might curse her for their misery. She thought of the sweet beauty of her child, on whom she had entailed sorrow, suffering, and temptation. She felt it murmuring at the fountain of life while it stretched its little hand to her lips. She turned aside the thick leaves of the grapevine, and looked out upon the still blue sky, over which scarcely moved the thin white clouds. "My daughter," she faintly articulated, "thou knowest not the evil I have done thee. Let these bitter tears attest my penitence. Let me teach thee so to live, that thou mayest hereafter obtain in another world the paradise thou hast lost in this, lost by thy mother's guilt. O my daughter! Would that I alone might suffer, that the whole wrath of my offended Creator might fall on my head, and thou, and such as thou, might escape." The tears and the penitence of Eve prevailed. A heavenly messenger was dispatched to console her, to lift her thoughts to better hopes and less gloomy anticipations. Since the sin of our first parents and their banishment from paradise, these angel visits had been few and far between, and our first mother hailed his approach with awe and pleasure. "Eve," kindly spoke the divine visitant, Thy sorrow and thy penitence are all known to thy Creator, and though thy fault was great, yet he careth for thee. I am sent to comfort thee. As thou didst disobey the commands of God, death has been brought, indeed, upon thy posterity, but thy children may not curse thee. Thy daughters shall imitate thy penitence, and so secure the favour of heaven. To each one shall be given a spirit, capable of resisting temptation and assimilating to that holiness from which thou hast departed. Though sin and death hath entered the world by thy means, thy children will still have only their own sins to answer for, and may not justly reproach thee for their errors. True, Lord, responded Eve, but the altered sky, the hard earth that scarcely yields its treasures to the labour of Adam, and the changed natures of the animals that once meekly and kindly sported together, all tell me of my disobedience. And my daughter will turn her eyes upon me when suffering and trial come, and that look will reproach me as the cause. I am told that our children shall equal in number the leaves of the green wood, and the earth shall hereafter be peopled with beings like ourselves. I shrink to think on the mass of sorrow I have brought upon my daughters. She looked fondly on her babe, and timidly raised it toward the beneficent being who paused at her bower. When men shall become numerous, and there shall be many such beings as these, fair and frail, may not their beauty— She paused and looked anxiously up. Speak, Eve, said the messenger. Thy request shall be granted. I am sent to bestow upon thee whatever thou shalt ask for this thy firstborn daughter. I scarcely know, resumed Eve, thus encouraged, but I would ask for this first daughter of an erring mother something to warn her of even the approach of sin, something that will whisper caution and speak of innocence and purity, something, Lord, that will remind her of paradise. Hast thou not all that, Eve, in the voice within, the voice of conscience? Eve dropped her head upon her bosom. But that monitor may be disregarded. My daughters may, like their unhappy parent, stifle its voice and heedlessly neglect its warnings. I would have something that when flattery would mislead, beauty bewilder, or passion lead astray, would outwardly, as it were, bid them take heed, warn them to shrink from the very trail of the serpent whose insidious poison may corrupt and destroy. Hast thou nothing that will be to the innocent, the virtuous, like a second conscience, to cause them to shrink even from the appearance of evil? The angel smiled, and answered our mother with kindness, and a look of heavenly satisfaction. Most wisely hast thou petitioned, O Eve. Thou hast asked blessings for thy posterity, not for thyself. Thy daughters shall bless thee for the gift thy prayer has obtained. The spirit departed. The gift he bestowed may be seen on the face of the maiden when she shrinks from the too admiring gaze, when her ear is listening to the tale of love or flattery, when in the solitude of her own thoughts she starts at her own imaginings, when she shrinks even from her own reflected loveliness in the secrecy of home, or abroad trembles at the intrusive touch or familiar language of him who should be her guide, her protector from evil. That gift was the blush. End of section 2.
Section 3 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 3. The Bald Eagle. In one of the little villages sprinkled along the delicious valley of the Connecticut, there stood, not many years ago, a little tavern called the Bald Eagle. It was an old-fashioned building with a small antique portico in front, where, a lazy summer afternoon, the wise men of the village assembled to read newspapers, talk politics, and drink beer. Before the door stood a tall yellow signpost, from which hung a white sign emblazoned with a fierce bald-headed eagle, holding an olive branch in one claw and a flash of forked lightning in the other. Underneath was written in large black letters, "The Bald Eagle, Good Entertainment for Man and Beast, by Jonathan Dewlap, Esquire." One calm, sultry summer evening, the knot of village politicians had assembled, according to custom, at the tavern door. At the entrance sat the landlord, justice of the peace, and quorum, lolling in a rocking chair and dozing over the columns of the electioneering handbill. Along the benches of the portico were seated the village attorney, the schoolmaster, the tailor, and other personages of less note, but not less idle, nor less devoted to the affairs of the nation. To this worthy assembly of patriotic citizens, the schoolmaster was drowsily doling forth the news of the latest gazette. It was at that memorable epoch of our national history when Lafayette returned to visit in the evening of his days the land that owed so much to his youthful enthusiasm, and to see in the soft decline of life the consummation of his singular glory in the bosom of that country where it first began. His approach was everywhere hailed with heart-stirring joy. There was but one voice throughout the land, and every village through which he passed hailed him with rural festivities, addresses, odes, and a dinner at the tavern. Every step of his journey was regularly and minutely recorded in those voluminous chronicles of our country, the newspapers, and column after column was filled with long notices of the dinner he had eaten, and of the toasts drunk, and of the songs sung on the occasion. As the schoolmaster detailed to the group around him an account of these busy festivals, which were rapidly succeeding each other all over the country, the little soul he possessed kindled up within him. With true oratorical emphasis, he repeated a long list of toasts drunk on a recent celebration of the kind: the American Eagle, the day we celebrate, the New England Fair, the heroes who fought, bled, and died at Bunker Hill, of which I am one, and 1,000 others equally patriotic. He was interrupted by the merry notes of the stage horn, twanging in long drawn blasts over the blue hills that skirted the village, and shortly after a cloud of dust came rolling its light volume along the road, and the stagecoach wheeled up to the door. It was driven by a stout, thick-set young fellow, with a glowing red face that peeped out from under the wide brim of a white hat, like the setting sun from beneath a summer cloud. He was dressed in a wren-tailed gingham coat, with pocket-holes outside, and a pair of gray linen pantaloons, buttoned down each leg with a row of yellow bell-buttons. His vest was stripped with red and blue, and around his neck he wore a colored silk handkerchief, tied in a loose knot before and tucked in at the waistband. Beside him on his coach box sat 2 dusty travelers in riding caps, and the group within presented an uncomfortable picture of the miseries of traveling in a stagecoach in the month of June. In an instant all was noise and confusion in the barroom of the inn. Travelers that had just arrived and those about to set off in the evening coach came crowding in with their baggage, some eager to secure places and others lodgings. A noisy group was gathered at the bar, within which the landlady was bouncing to and fro in a huff, and jingling a great bunch of keys like some wild animal at a rarey show, stalking about its cage, whisking its tail, and jingling its iron chain. The fireplace was filled with pine boughs and asparagus tops, and over it the wall was covered with advertisements of new invented machines, patent medicines, toll-gate and turnpike companies, and coarse prints of steamboats, stagecoaches, opposition lines, and Fortune's Home Forever. On the corner stood an old-fashioned oaken settee, with a high back and crooked elbows which served as a seat by day and a bed by night. In another was a pile of trunks and different articles of a traveler's equipage. Traveling coats hung here and there about the room, and the atmosphere was thick with the smoke of tobacco and the fumes of brandy. At length the sound of wheels was heard at the door. "Stage ready!" shouted the coachman, putting his head in at the door. There was a hurry and bustle about the room. The travelers crowded out. A short pause succeeded. The carriage door was slammed to in haste, and the coach wheeled away and disappeared in the dusk of the evening. The sounds of the wheels had hardly ceased to be heard when the tailor entered the bar-room with a newspaper in his hand, and strutted up to the squire and the schoolmaster, who sat talking together upon the settee, with a step that would have done honor to the tragedy hero of a strolling theater. He had just received the tidings that Lafayette was on his way north. The stage driver had brought the news. The passengers confirmed it. It was in the newspapers, and of course there could be no doubt upon the subject. It now became a general topic of conversation in the bar-room. The villagers came in one by one, all were on tiptoe, all talked together. Lafayette, the Marquis, the General. He would pass through the village in 2 days from then. What was to be done? The town authorities were at their wits' end, and were quite as anxious to know how they should receive their venerable guest as they were to receive him. In the meantime, the news took wing. There was a crowd at the door of the post office, talking with becoming zeal upon the subject. The boys in the street gave 3 cheers and shouted, "Lafayette forever!" And in less than 10 minutes the approaching jubilee was known and talked of in every nook and corner of the village. The town authorities assembled in the little back parlor of the inn to discuss the subject more at leisure over a mug of cider, and conclude upon the necessary arrangements for the occasion. Here they continued with closed doors until a late hour, and after much debate, finally resolved to decorate the tavern hall, prepare a great dinner, order out the militia, and take the general by surprise. The lawyer was appointed to write an oration, and the schoolmaster an ode for the occasion. As night advanced, the crowd gradually dispersed from the street. Silence succeeded to the hum of rejoicing, and nothing was heard throughout the village but the occasional bark of a dog, the creaking of the tavern sign, and the no less musical accents of the one-keyed flute of the schoolmaster, who, perched at his chamber window in nightgown and slippers, serenaded the neighborhood with "Fire on the Mountains" and half of "Washington's March," while the grocer who lived next door, roused from sweet dreams of treacle and brown sugar, lay tossing in his bed and wishing the deuce would take the schoolmaster with his Latin and his one-keyed flute. As day began to peep next morning, the tailor was seen to issue out of the inn yard in the landlord's yellow wagon, with the negro hostler Caesar mounted behind, thumping about in the tail of the vehicle, and grinning with huge delight. As the gray of morning mellowed, life began to course again in the little village. The cock hailed the daylight cheerily, the sheep bleated from the hills, the sky grew softer and clearer, the blue mountains caught the rising sun, the mass of white vapor that filled the valley began to toss and roll itself away, like ebb of a feathery sea. Then the bustle of advancing day began. The doors and windows were thrown open, the gate creaked on its hinge, carts rattled by, villagers were moving in the streets, and the little world began to go, like some ponderous machine that wheel after wheel is gradually put in motion. In a short time the tailor was seen slowly returning along the road, with a wagon load of pine boughs and evergreens. The wagon was unloaded at the tavern door, and its precious cargo carried up into the hall, where the tailor, in his shirt sleeves, danced and capered about the room, with a hatchet in one hand and a long knife in the other, like an Indian warrior before going to battle. In a moment the walls were stripped of the faded emblems of former holidays, garlands of withered roses were trampled underfoot, old stars that had lost their luster were seen to fall, and the white pine chandelier was robbed of its yellow coat, and dangled from the ceiling quite woebegone and emaciated. But ere long the whole room was again filled with arches and garlands and festoons and stars and all kinds of singular devices in green leaves and asparagus tops. Over the chimney-piece were suspended 2 American flags, with a portrait of General Washington beneath them, and the names of Trenton, Yorktown, Bunker Hill, etc., peeped out from between the evergreens cut in red morocco, and fastened to the wall with a profusion of brass nails. Every part of the room was liberally decorated with paper eagles, and in the corner hung a little black ship rigged with twine and armed with a whole broadside of umbrella tips. It were in vain to attempt a description of all the wonders that started up beneath the tailor's hand, as from the touch of a magician's wand. In a word, before night everything was in readiness. Travelers that arrived in the evening brought information that the general would pass through the village at noon the next day, but without the slightest expectation of the jubilee that awaited him. The tailor was beside himself with joy at the news, and pictured to himself with good-natured self-complacency the surprise and delight of the venerable patriot when he should receive the public honors prepared for him, and the new blue coat with bright buttons and velvet collar, which was then making at his shop. In the meantime, the landlady had been busy in making preparations for a sumptuous dinner. The lawyer had been locked up all day, hard at work upon his oration, and the pedagogue was hard ridden by the phantom of a poetical eulogy that bestowed his imagination like a nightmare. Nothing was heard in the village but the bustle of preparation and the martial music of drums and fifes. For a while the ponderous wheel of labor was seen to stand still. The clatter of the cooper's mallet was silent. The painter left his brush, the cobbler his awl, and the blacksmith's bellows lay sound asleep, with its nose buried in the ashes. The next morning at daybreak, the whole military force of the town was marshaled forth in front of the tavern, armed and equipped as the law directs. Conspicuous among this multitude stood the tailor, arrayed in a coat of his own making, all lace and buttons, and a pair of buff pantaloons drawn up so tight that he could hardly touch his feet to the ground. He wore a military hat shaped like a clamshell, with little white goose feathers stuck all around the edge. By his side stood the gigantic figure of the blacksmith in rusty regimentals. At length the roll of the drum announced the order for forming the ranks, and the valiant host displayed itself in a long wavering line. There stood a tall lantern-jawed fellow, all legs, furbished up with a red waistcoat and shining green coat, a little round wool hat perched on the back of his head, and downward tapering off in a pair of yellow nankeens, twisted and wrinkled about the knees as if his legs had been screwed into them. Beside him stood a long-waisted being with a head like a hurrah's nest, set off with a willow hat and a face that looked as if it were made of sole leather, and a gash cut in the middle of it for a mouth. Next came a little man with fierce black whiskers and sugar-loaf hat, equipped with a long flowing piece of powder horn and a white canvas knapsack with a red star on the back of it. Then a country bumpkin standing bolt upright, his head elevated, his toes turned out, holding fast his gun with one hand and keeping the other spread out upon his right thigh. Then figured the descendant of some revolutionary veteran, arrayed in the uniform and bearing the arms and accoutrements of his ancestor, a cocked hat on his head, a heavy musket on his shoulder, and on his back a large knapsack marked U.S. Here was a man in straw hat and gingham jacket, and there a pale, nervous fellow, buttoned up to the chin in a drab greatcoat, to guard him against the morning air and keep out the fever and ague. "Attention the whole! Front face! Eyes right! Eyes left! Steady! Attention to the roll!" shouted the blacksmith in a voice like a volcano. "Peleg Popgun! Here! Tribulation Sheepshanks! Here! Return Jonathan Babcock! Here!" And so on through a whole catalogue of long, hard names. "Attention! Shoulder! Arms! Very well, fall back there on the extreme left. No talking in the ranks. Present arms! Squire Wiggins, you're not in line, if you please. A little farther in, a little farther out. There, I guess that will do. Carry arms! Very well done. Quick time upon your post. March!" In the little red-coated drummer flourished his drumsticks. The bandy-legged fifer struck up Yankee Doodle. Caesar showed his flat face over the horizon of a great bass drum, like the moon in an eclipse. The tailor brandished his sword, and the whole company, wheeling with some confusion around the tavern signpost, streamed down the road, covered with dust and followed by a troop of draggle-tailed boys. As soon as this company had disappeared, and the dub of its drum ceased to be heard, the toot-toot of a shrill trumpet sounded across the plains, and a troop of horses came riding up. The leader was a jolly round-faced butcher, with a red fox tail nodding over his head, and came spurring on, with his elbows flapping up and down like a pair of wings. As he approached the tavern, he ordered the troop to wheel and form a line in front, a maneuver which, though somewhat arduous, was nevertheless executed with wonderful skill and precision. This body of light horse was the pride of the whole country round, and was mounted and caparisoned in a style of splendor that dazzled the eyes of all the village. Each horseman wore a cap of bearskin crested with a foxtail, a short blue jacket faced with yellow, and profusely ornamented with red morocco and quality binding. The pantaloons were of the same color as the jackets, and were trimmed with yellow cord. Some rode with long stirrups, some with short stirrups, and some with no stirrups at all. Some sat perpendicular upon their saddles, some at an obtuse angle, and others at an angle of 45. One was mounted on a tall, one-eyed bone setter, with his tail and his ears cropped. Another on a little red nag, with shaggy mane and a long switch-tail, and as vicious as if the very devil were in him. Here was a great fellow, with long curly whiskers, looking as fierce as Mars himself. There a little hook-nosed creature, with red crest, short spurs, elbows stuck out, and jacket cocked up behind, looking like a barn-door rooster, with his tail chipped, just preparing to crow. While this formidable troop was formed to the satisfaction of their leader, the word of command was given, and they went through the sword exercise, hewing and cutting the air in all directions, with the most cool and deliberate courage. The order was then given to draw pistols. Ready, aim, fire! Pop, pop, pop went the pistols. Toot, toot, toot went the trumpet. The horses took fright at the sound. Some plunged, others reared and kicked, and others started out of the line and capered up and down like mad. The captain being satisfied with this display of the military discipline of his troop, they wheeled off in sections, and rode gallantly into the tavern yard to recruit from the fatigues of the morning. Crowds of country people now came crowding in from all directions to see the fun and the general. The honest farmer in broad-brimmed hat and broad-skirted coat jogged slowly on with his wife and half a dozen blooming daughters, in a square-top chaise, and country beaux and all their Sunday finery came racing along in wagons, or parading around on horseback to win a sidelong look from some fair country lass in gypsy hat and blue ribbons. In the meantime, the schoolmaster was far from being idle. His scholars had been assembled at the early hour, and after a deal of drilling and good advice, they arranged in a line in front of the schoolhouse, to bask in the sun and wait for the general. The little girls had wreaths of roses upon their heads and baskets of flowers in their hands, and the boys carried Bibles and wore papers in their hats inscribed, "Welcome, Lafayette." The schoolmaster walked up and down before them with a rattan in his hand, repeating to himself his poetic eulogy, stopping now and then to rap some unlucky little rogue over the knuckles for misdemeanor, shaking one to make him turn out his toes, and pulling another's ear to make him hold up his head and look like a man. In this manner the morning wore away, and the hour at which it had been rumored that the general was to arrive drew near. The whole military force, both foot and horse, was then summoned together in front of the tavern, and formed into a hollow square, and the colonel, a swarthy knight of the forge, by the aid of a scrawl written by the squire, and placed in the crown of his hat, made a most eloquent and patriotic harangue, in which he called the soldiers his brothers in arms, the hope of their country, the terror of the enemies, the bulwark of liberty, and the safeguard of the fair sex. They were then wheeled back again into a line, and dismissed for 10 minutes. An hour or two previous, an honest old black named Boaz had been stationed upon the high road, not far from the entrance of the village, equipped with a loaded gun which he was ordered to discharge by way of signal as soon as the general should appear. Full of the importance and dignity of his office, Boaz marched to and fro across the dusty road with his musket ready cocked and his finger on the trigger. This maneuvering in the sun, however, diminished the temperature of his enthusiasm in proportion as it increased that of his body, till at length he sat down on a stump in the shade and, leaning his musket against the trunk of a tree, took a short-stemmed pipe out of his pocket and began to smoke. As noonday drew near, he grew hungry and homesick. His heart sunk into his stomach. His African philosophy dwindled apace in a mere theory. Overpowered by the heat of the weather, he grew drowsy. His pipe fell from his mouth. His head lost its equipoise and drooped like a poppy upon his breast, and sliding gently from his seat, he fell asleep at the root of the tree. He was aroused from his slumber by the noise of an empty wagon that came rattling along a crossroad near him. Thus suddenly awakened, he thought of the general's approach. The idea of being caught asleep at his post and the shame of having given the signal too late flashed together across his bewildered mind, and springing upon his feet, he caught his musket, shut both eyes, and fired, to the utter consternation of the wagoner, whose horses took fright at the sound and became unmanageable. Poor Boaz, when he saw the mistake he had made and the mischief he had done, did not wait long to deliberate, but, throwing his musket over his shoulder, bounded into the woods, and was out of sight in the twinkling of an eye. The sharp report of the gun rang far and wide through the hush of the noontide, awakening many in a drowsy echo that grumbled in the distance, like a man aroused untimely from his rest. At the sound of the long-expected signal gun, the whole village was put in motion. The drum beat to order, the ranks were formed in haste, and the whole military force moved off to escort the general in, amid the waving of banners, the roll of drums, the scream of fifes, and the twang of the horse trumpet. All was now anxious expectation at the village. The moments had passed like hours. The lawyer appeared at the tavern door with his speech in his hand. The schoolmaster and his scholars stood broiling in the sun, and many a searching look was cast along the dusty highway to descry some indication of their guest's approach. Sometimes a little cloud of dust rolling along the distant road would cheat them with a vain illusion. Then the report of musketry and the roll of drums, rattling among the hills and dying on the breeze, would inspire the fugitive hope that he had at length arrived, and a murmur of eager expectation would run from mouth to mouth. "There he comes! That's he!" And the people would crowd into the street to be again disappointed. 1 o'clock arrived, 2, 3, but no general. The dinner was overdone, the landlady in great tribulation, the cook in a great passion. The gloom of disappointment began to settle on many a countenance. The people looked doubtingly at each other and guessed. The sky, too, began to lower. Volumes of black clouds piled themselves up in the west and threatened a storm. The ducks were unusually noisy and quarrelsome around the green pool in the stable yard, and a flock of ill-boding crows were holding ominous consultation around the top of a tall pine. Everything gave indication of an approaching thunder gust. A distant, irregular peal rattled along the sky like a volley of musketry. They thought it was a salute to the general. Soon after, the air grew damp and misty. It began to drizzle. A few drops pattered on the roofs, and it set in to rain. A scene of confusion ensued. The pedagogue and his disciples took shelter in the schoolhouse. The crowd dispersed in all directions, with handkerchiefs thrown over their heads, and their gowns tucked up, and everything looked dismal and disheartening. The bar-room was full of disconsolate faces. Some tried to keep their spirits up by drinking, others wished to laugh the matter off, and others stood with their hands in their pockets, looking out of the window to see it rain, and making wry faces. Night drew on apace, and the rain continued. Still nothing was to be heard of the general. Some were for dispatching a messenger to ascertain the cause of this delay. But who would go out in such a storm? At length the monotonous toot-toot of the horse trumpet was heard. There was a great chattering and splashing of hoofs at the door, and the troop reined up, spattered with mud, drenched through and through, and completely crestfallen. Not long after, the foot company came straggling in, dripping wet and diminished to one half of its number by desertions. The tailor entered the bar-room, reeking and disconsolate, a complete epitome of the miseries of human life written in his face. The feathers were torn out of his clamshell hat, his coat was thoroughly sponged, his boots full of water, and his buff pantaloons clung tighter than ever to his little legs. He trembled like a leaf. One might have taken him for fever and ague personified. The blacksmith, on the contrary, seemed to dread the water as little as if it were his element. The rain did not penetrate him, and he rolled into the bar-room like a great sea-calf, that, after sporting about in the waves, tumbles himself out upon the sand to dry. 1,000 questions were asked at once about the general, but there was nobody to answer them. They had seen nothing of him. They had heard nothing of him. They knew nothing of him. Their spirits and patience were completely soaked out of them. No patriotism was proof against such torrents of rain. Every heart seemed now to sink in despair. Every hope had given way when the twang of the stage horn was heard, sending forth its long-drawn cadences and enlivening the gloom of a rainy twilight. The coach dashed up to the door. It was empty, not a solitary passenger. The coachman came in without a dry thread about him. A little stream of water trickled down his back from the rim of his hat. There was something dismally ominous in his look. He seemed to be a messenger of bad news. "The general! The general! Where's the general?" "He's gone on by another road." "So much for the opposition line and the new turnpike," said the coachman as he tossed off a glass of New England. "He has lost a speech," said the lawyer. "He has lost a coat," said the tailor. "He's lost a dinner," said the landlord. It was a gloomy night at the Bald Eagle. A few boon companions sat late over their bottle, drank hard, and tried to be merry, but it would not do. Good humor flagged, the jokes were bad, the laughter forced, and one after another slunk away to bed, full of bad liquor and reeling with the fumes of brandy and beer. End of section 3.
Section 4 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 4. Hunter's Grave, by Joseph R. Chandler. Brother Chandler, thou hast done well to record the virtues of thy dog, and believe me, the world will think the better of thee for sorrowing at his departure and cherishing his memory. As the nature-loving and hair-training Cowper hath said, "The heart is hard in nature, and unfit for human fellowship, as being void of sympathy and therefore dead alike to love and friendship both, that is not pleased with sight of animals enjoying life, nor feels their happiness augment his own. So hast thou proved thyself devoid of hardness of heart, and established thy claim to be a fit companion for human fellowship. By this quiet and tender picture thou hast given of thy domestic bereavement. My friend, give me thy hand, albeit I have never seen thee, for when I come to Philadelphia, I shall claim the privilege of going with thee to visit the resting place of Hunter, and to weep with thee, tear for tear. Verily I would sooner make a pilgrimage to such a shrine than the proud monument that hides the ashes of the tyrant who lived but to scourge and oppress his fellow men. Hunter's Grave, by Joseph R. Chandler. We advise much exercise, active or passive, as circumstances may require or may favor to our citizens. A good long walk or ride every day will lengthen life and multiply the pleasures of living, and besides the mere physical agitation of a walk or ride, there is a change of thought that is wholesome, a diversion of the mind from one object to another, or from one set of objects to many. These advantages are too much overlooked by the young, until a habit is acquired, when the vis inertiae overcomes the conviction of a necessity for exercise, and body and mind fail from a neglect to give them variety and change. We love, though we have neglected the means of health too long to hope for its acquisition. We love to ride through the lanes, and over the open fields in the vicinity of the city, and catch the breathing of spring, while we enjoy that rapid mental action which denoted the improvement of time, which exercise and new scenery secure. One morning, last week, we were allowing our old horse Rolla to take his own time in moving along, a species of indulgence which he claims as a privilege of age and old acquaintance, making up for any seeming slowness in going forth by a shuffling anxiety in returning to reach his crib. There had been a fall of rain during the night, and the clouds had not cleared away. Striking across a field, we soon reached the object of our search. A little mound of earth, only half sodded over, denoted the place where poor old Hunter had been laid only a few weeks before. We alighted, and threw Royla's reins over a low pine shrub that grew at the head of the grave, and gave loose to our own feelings. It is not seemingly to mourn a dog, but when for 11 years the animal has followed your footsteps, when his clear voice has greeted your return, or when coiled up at your feet, day after day he has lifted his flexible eyebrows, and turned his dark eye to see when you would leave the writing table, and go forth for his pleasure as he had tarried for you, you feel as if the death of even a dog might warrant a melancholy sensation, and be pleaded in excuse for a recollection of at least his canine virtues. Hunter had become a sort of precursor of our own comings, and those who would meet us as we came to or went from our office would watch for Hunter, that they might find us. A feeling had sprung up between us, as we had learned even to check with each other's faults. He undoubtedly had the most to do, or at least the most to suffer in that respect, but still he tried, and sometimes succeeded. The poor dog had become a member of the family when it was small, and the flock that had risen up like olive branches around our table were affectionately guarded and tenderly fondled by Hunter. But he never confessed the right of mastership in them. He took his place on the hearthrug before them, with as much independence as if they had been his offspring instead of ours, and when business or pleasure called us from the city, he took upon himself the guardianship of the domestic circle, and declined his daily visit to the office as much as if he had a pecuniary investment in the dwelling or was morally and legally responsible for the welfare of its inmates. Hunter had been in perils. He was bitten, with one other canine friend, by a mad dog. His friend died with hydrophobia. Kind attention saved Hunter. He remembered it to the last, and when the sickness came from which he was not relieved, the beseeching look and the particular emphasis of his moan showed that he remembered with gratitude favors past, and desired a reapplication of the remedies. But he asked in vain. He pined away as faculty after faculty departed, until voice failed, the hearing ceased, and the eye was lifted up slowly, but dim, and the tail slightly moved to indicate his recognition of him who had been so long his companion, and his last effort was to lick the delicate hand of a child, who had come to take his leave of one that seemed twined with his earliest love, and whose name was the first word he had articulated. Old Samson took the dog in his barrow, and went forth with a measured step, to find a place where he might give him the decency of burial, without intruding upon the repose of human beings who, made in a better image, justly claim a sanctity for their dust. The little procession, as it went forth, had with it something of a touching air. The body of Hunter was decently covered, not ostentatiously, lest a ridicule should attach to the scene, and Samson had put on his best clothes, avowedly less for funeral purposes than what he might appear decently before the mistress. Little Willie, the only follower of the train, had drawn his cap over his eyes to hide a few hasty tears, and was regulating his step by the solemn and measured movement of Samson. Few felt an interest to inquire what was hidden beneath the white pall, and the unwonted melancholy of the child was suffered to pass without inquiry. When the procession had reached the place of sepulture, the body was lowered, not thrown, into the grave, and Samson remarked that the collar was still about Hunter's neck. "I'll take it off," said he. "It will do for another dog." Little Willie leaned over and looked down into the grave, and then, lifting his streaming eye to his sable companion, he said, "No. Let it be, Samson. Let it be. I don't want any more dogs, and if I do have one, I don't want to see Hunter's collar on his neck." Samson sodded up the grave and turned towards him. "Will you ride in the barrow?" said he to Willie. The child turned and looked at the carriage with a shudder and walked onward. When Willie reached home, he went and sat down alone beside Hunter's house, and wept a flood of tears. And it was only when the memorials of his faithful friend, more than twice his own age, had been removed that he could dry up his tears. And even now the mention of the dog makes the clouds return after the rain, and cast a gloom over the sunny spirit of the child. While bending over the resting place of the faithful animal, it was natural that we should think of his merits, and what we had lost in him. So selfish is even human grief, and half of what constituted our painful feelings were thus musing, resulting from the certainty that we would no more benefit by his services. Who would weep in this world if what was taken away diminished nothing of his enjoyment? We mounted the horse to return, but yet lingered. Reflection had come, and with it came fancy. Imagination was busy to people space with objects that we once had loved and now mourned, and, for a moment, it seemed as if the smiling face of Hunter was before us, and his head turned half as if to invite us to move. A slight breeze from the west wafted onward the fog that was hanging over the river at a little distance, and as masses swept by us, one seemed to take the place and form which our fancy had just given as Hunter's. We started, the airy form played fantastically around, and then vanished in the thicket beyond. It could scarcely have all been fancy, for the horse, Rolla, moved suddenly, as was his wont, when formerly Hunter had manifested his joy at the prospect of exercise by jumping upward toward his bridle, with a sharp but friendly bark. The misty form of the dog reappeared at the top of the hill, and as it passed rapidly onward, was tinged with rainbow hues from the sun glinting between the broken clouds above. We know that if men would weep, there are all around them the graves of good, whose loss the living may deplore, whose life was fruitful of good for man. But may not one turn aside, also from the beaten path of grief or joy, and in solitude remember that beneath the sod before him moulders one who never deceived, and, though not gifted with words to make known his affections, had yet the skill to express them with the most miraculous organs. End of Section 4.
Section 5 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 5. The Wife's First Love. Adelheid, hearing her husband's approaching footsteps, hastened to extinguish the little taper that was burning on the table, and adjusting her collarette and coiffure before the mirror, unlocked the door of the boudoir, and went forth to meet him with an unembarrassed air. "Comment, ma belle ermite, toujours au boudoir? I was looking for you at the Tuileries this very fine day. Truly, my incomparable, I shall begin to grow jealous of that crimson fauteuil whose arms encircle you so often." As the Maurier playfully spoke thus, he drew his Adelheid affectionately toward him, but she complained of a slight indisposition, averted her face, and, withdrawing herself from his clasp, pointed his attention to some passing object in the street, and began to talk of their projected tour to Fontainebleau. Adelheid Eichroth was a young and lovely Berlinese, who at the age of 17 had been introduced to the Count de Maurier, a Frenchman of family and distinction. He became deeply enamoured of her beauty and simplicity. The offer of his hand was graciously accepted, and he brought her in triumph to his hotel in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. where, notwithstanding the little dissensions that a difference of national tastes and prejudices is apt to occasion, they lived in the very plenitude and perfection of conjugal concord. They had been married about a year and a half, when the Maurier fancied he observed an alteration in his wife's habits and manners. It appeared to him that his adored Adelheid was becoming less frank and confiding toward him. She was reserved, distrait. There was an air of mystery in her proceedings. In fact, it was evident that she had some secret with which she was sedulously desirous he should remain unacquainted. He was constantly in the habit of finding scraps of paper scattered about the floor, for the appearance of which she accounted in various unsatisfactory ways. He more than once surprised her in whispered conference with old Karl, a German domestic, who, having lived in her father's service since the period of Adelheid's infancy, had on the event of her marriage requested to be allowed to accompany his young mistress to Paris. On his approach they would suddenly separate, and, as it seemed to him, in something of confusion. He had also on one occasion been exceedingly perplexed and mortified by overhearing two ladies in society, after extolling the undeniable beauty and grace and affability of Madame de Maurier, make an exception to her prejudice. The particulars did not reach his ear, which was immediately followed by an exclamation of "Mon Dieu, ce n'est pas possible! Une bête, un monstre, affreuse, dégoûtant!" He was not quite sure that the epithets were applied to his wife, but he more than suspected they were. It was not long after that, on entering her apartment unexpectedly, he saw her rush toward the open window and dash something to the ground. "Bah, bah! Adelheid, why surely I have entered Aubigeon's fabrique in mistake for my own hotel. Essence de millefleurs, attar du rose. What are all these scents that you are scattering about the room? You will suffocate me with your many sweets. I have often told you of my aversion to strong perfumes." The suspicious husband, having observed Madame, in one of her late mystic meetings with the old steward, confide a large purse of gold to his possession, hastily quitted the room, full of vague apprehensions and surmises, and fully resolved to take an early opportunity of satisfying himself in what manner his wife was in the habit of employing the intervals of his absence from home, which, owing to a pending lawsuit, had become of late very frequent and protracted. Yet he loved and respected her too much to distress her with open and direct inquiries on the subject of her visible confusion. Accordingly, on the day following this little brusquerie, he took occasion during breakfast to signify that he was engaged out on business for the whole of the day, and should probably be detained until the evening of the morrow. Not long, however, after the usual hour of dinner, he made his appearance. The old steward opened the door. "What, Karl? As I left you in the morning, I find you in the evening. Toujours la pipe. Always smoking. Is madame at home?" "Non, monsieur, non." "No? I think you are mistaken, Karl. I am nearly positive that I saw her close the jalousie of her boudoir this moment in a white dressing-gown. Is she alone?" "Yes, sir, alone, sir. To be sure she is alone. At least, that is, I will tell her you are come, and I thank you, I can inform her myself. Why, no, that is, just, if you please, sir, to allow me, maybe she might be engaged, or—" "Engaged? Ah, what? With whom?" "Oh, with nobody, sir." "Let me pass, old man. What does this mean?" "Nothing, sir. But if you would only now, do, sir, only just wait a moment, that I may tell my lady, sir. She will be so frightened. You will be so angry." "Angry? Yes, I am angry at your unaccountable detention of me." The count's brain instantly took fire. Imagination mastered reason. Yet he adopted a reasonable course in resolutely shaking the old man from his hold, and striding swiftly and silently along the range of rooms that led to his Adelheid's apartment. In a state of considerable excitement, he pushed open the boudoir door with vehemence, but stood transfixed on the threshold at the spectacle that presented itself to his view. His young and lovely wife was reclining listlessly in the large armchair, her foot reposing on a low footstool, her elbow resting on a small table at her side, while her delicate hand sustained an enormous chibouk, from which he was puffing clouds of fragrant incense. His astonishment soon relaxed into immoderate laughter. So, my fair Mussulman, I've caught you at last. Now the secret's out, and the mystery, like most other mysteries, ends in smoke. That Jesuitical old carl, too, to conspire against me. Truth, Adelheid, I don't know that I ever saw you look more graceful, charming, more femininely lovely. Nay, don't pout, blush, and cry, and throw down that most magnificent chibouk so disdainfully. I'll buy it off you, mignon. Will you sell it to me, eh? And throwing his arms around her, he hid her tears of mortification in his bosom. And now, my sweet wife, resumed the Maurier, as Adelheid released herself from his lengthened embrace, we will put away this toy, if you please, until we go back to Berlin. Custom here is everything. Now the Parisian ladies are not yet accustomed. That is, it is not yet the fashion here. In short, my love, the Parisian ladies don't smoke. End of section 5.
Section 6 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 6, A Flower in the Desert, by Seba Smith. I saw a forest dark and drear, and in that desert wild, the lonely traveller to cheer, one beauteous rosebud smiled. The opening leaves were just in view, and loveliness was there, bathing in drops of morning dew, and breathing balmy air. And when I passed that way again, I turned me to the bower, but those fair leaves were faded then, and withered was that flower. Rank weeds and wild grass, deadly foes, had clasped it in their arms, and robbed that sweet uncultured rose of all its lively charms. But in a wilder desert yet a fairer floweret grows, which wilder weeds will soon beset, and far more deadly foes. A little idle wandering girl has often met my view. Her locks in graceful ringlets curl, her young bright eyes are blue. She lightly trips about the streets, and smiles on all she sees, and hears from every one she meets, "What rosy cheeks are these?" But let those eyes and cheeks beware, for they may weep and fade. This wicked world has many a snare for such an orphan maid. Some guardian angel will, I ween, watch o'er the friendless child. This little girl's a flower I've seen, the city is the wild. End of section 6. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 7 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tad Davis, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 7. Mary Magdalene, A Tradition of Nain. Mary arose from the crimson pillows on which she had been reposing, and, approaching the window, drew back with a silken rope the heavy draperies of purple inwrought with gold, which shaded the apartment from the direct rays of the sun, and gazed with a thoughtful brow out on the quiet streets of the city of Nain. Beyond the walls lay the sea, whose waters reflected back to heaven the 1,000 resplendent lights and shadows scattered along the western horizon by the flashing rays of the setting sun, and in the far distance, like a streak of gray clouds, lay the mountains of Judea. Many a shallop, richly laden, was gliding over the still waters, some bound outward, freighted with rich dyes and stuffs of Nazareth, some coming into port bearing treasures of gold and jewels from distant lands, others with costly silks and fine paintings, polished mirrors of steel and silver, and pearls and wrought ivory from the Ionian Isles. The chant of the oarsmen, as their oars splashed lazily in the glowing waters, came faintly and sweetly on the ear, and the white sails, scarcely swelling in the breeze, looked like saffron-tinted clouds. Then came stealing and chirping on the stillness of the vesper hymns of the birds, and blending as they did with the gradually decreasing hum of the city, as the evening mist brooded over it, they were sounds which shed over the spirit of Mary Magdalene something like peace. A band of young and beauteous maidens now tripped along with jars filled from the purest well in the city. Then came a crowd of children dancing to the cymbals and lutes, and trailing after them long vines of flowers and interwoven wreaths, and sending out their joyous laughter and sounds of mirth which well accorded with the sweet harmony of music. Mary Magdalene turned her eyes wearily away from those tokens of peace and joy, and leaning her head against a pillar, wept. A low, sweet voice aroused her, singing an old Jewish song which told in sad poetry the tale of a broken heart. The singer was a young and lovely girl just blushing into the morning of life. Her skin was like polished ivory, save where a rose tint flushed her cheeks and dyed the tips of her taper fingers. Her large blue eyes were cast downward, and the full red lips just parted enough to reveal 2 rows of pearl-like teeth. Her exquisitely formed arms and bust, combined with a slight and graceful figure, now half hidden by a profusion of sunny hair, which fell back from her sad childish forehead and swept the mosaic pavement, completed the beautiful picture. Mary started as the voice told her slave had been a witness to her emotion, and raising her magnificent form to its utmost height, while her commanding black eye flashed with anger, exclaimed, "Thou here? Away, slave! How dost thou dare see me weep?" The timid voice was stifled, and the fair young head bowed in silence and tears. After gazing on the young maiden a few moments, during which short space anger, contempt, and an expression of mysterious bitterness alternately changed her countenance, the touching and beautiful grief of Addie moved her better spirit and chased away every feeling except pity. "Come hither, Addie. Come hither, poor bird. Forgive thy mistress's wayward mood, and sing again. But sing something to enliven my heart, for it is heavy and sad, child. Sing something to stir the still fountain of gladness. Sing, sing, Addie. Is not thy cage a gilded one? Then wherefore sad and silent?" "The star that lit my path, lady, is gone out. Zimri, the widow's son, is dead." "Huh? Dead? Poor child, I pity thee. Yet, Addie, come hither. I would tell thee, maiden, to cherish a love for the dead. Let it not go out, and leave thy heart like the waters of that sea whose sullen waves cover those olden cities which were destroyed in their might and glory by Jehovah. Thou hast heard of the fruits which grow on its banks. Yea, lady, let love for the dead go out, and thou wilt become like me. Yes, Addie, me, beautiful and bright to the eye, but within bitterness and ashes. But hark!" "Oh, lady," sobbed the young slave, "that sound of grief is the wail of Zimri's mother and kinsmen. They are bearing him past to the grave." Addie rushed to the window, and straining her eyes through the misty twilight, saw the bier on which was laid the dead body of Zimri, and over it the bending form of his widowed mother weeping, and by the torch's light which they carried, the sorrowful faces of his kinsmen. "They are coming, lady," she cried to Mary, who had thrown herself again on the crimson pillows of her couch. "O Zimri, is that still form never more to move? Methinks I see now the smile on his white lips, and the waves of his shining hair on his gentle brow. See, lady, they are beneath the window, and the pall has fallen so closely around him that you can see the beauty of his form even in death. Why do they stop? A crowd approaches. Who? What? It is Jesus and his followers." Mary started from her recumbent posture, and throwing back the tresses of long black hair which had fallen like a veil around her, with a look of intense anxiety gazed on the face of Addie, who, unheeding her mistress's emotion, continued, "He is like one of our mountain palms in his majesty. His brow is like the evening star, and his serene lips drop honey. He approaches the widow. He looks on her tears with eyes of tender pity. He speaks. He raises his face toward heaven and reaches forth his hand and lays it on the dead. God of my fathers, the dead!" And with a loud and piercing shriek, she rushed forth into the streets. Mary started up with an expression of dread and wonder, and looking down on the crowd below, saw the youth arising from his bier at the command of Jesus. She saw him with the warm breath of life in his nostrils, who a few moments past was dead and cold. And as the shouts from the assembled people rent the air, many of whom were now willing to believe on and worship him who had wrought the miracle, he bowed his head meekly on his bosom, and gathered the folds of his garment around him, glided noiselessly away from the multitude. After long hours of abstraction, Mary lifted her head from her bosom, and, approaching a mirror, folded her arms and gazed on her image with an expression of scorn and bitterness. Anon tears coursed over her flushed cheeks. Her bosom heaved as if some pent-up agony wrung her heart. "Why art thou weeping?" said a voice near her. "Why art thou weeping, Mary?" "Ha, Faithann!" "Aye, Faithann," he answered. "Faithann, the king's son, who abides here in the common garb of a publican to be near thee." "Go to thy father's palace again, Faithann," answered Mary sadly, and without turning to look on the beautiful youth with his brown curling hair and dark blue eyes, which gazed with incredulous wonder on her. "Mary," said he, "thou art angered with me. I came but to bring a parting gift, Mary. My father is wroth against me because I am not at the head of his soldiery, and hath sent his chief officer to bring me to his presence. But I will go out of the city tonight while he sleepeth, and ere the first watches of the morning Faithann will be on his war horse with helmet and battle spear and plume, and ready for the fight." Her lips quivered and paled as she turned and looked on him, and her voice was plaintive as she replied, "Go, Faithann. Thou art bright and beautiful in mine eyes, and verily have I loved thee. But go, I pray never more to see that face again. I pray never more to hear the words of thy silvery and honeyed tongue again. I have sinned. Go from me." He looked steadfastly and sternly on her while she spoke, and with a searching glance said, "Hast thou seen the Nazarene who calleth himself Jesus?" "I have," she answered calmly, "and tomorrow, while thou art going to battle, I shall be kneeling in the dust at his feet." Faithann laughed tauntingly, and turning on his iron heel, replied, "Look on my gift, Mary." And he laid an exquisite wrought casket at her feet. The light from the scented lamp, which threw upward delicious odors from its silver pedestal, shone down on the interior of the casket and glittered on the gold and precious stones that were therein in many-hued sparkles of brilliance. There was also an alabaster box set round with jewels, which contained spikenard and ointment, such as queens used. "Hence, tempter!" she shrieked. "Hence, or I will send thy name out on the ears of the sleepers of Nain like tenfold thunder. Hence, I say, for the devils which tear my soul are raving within me." Unaccustomed to her strange mood, he left the apartment hastily. She threw herself prostrate on the floor and pressed her burning forehead against the cold marble, and writhed and wept and sorrowed mightily, for mightily had the Magdalene sinned. When she arose from her humble posture, it was past the middle watch of the night, and the inhabitants of the city had gone to rest, and all was silent save the watch-cry of the sentinel as he passed the wall, and the occasional clamor of his armor as he changed from hand to hand his heavy spear. The rippling of gentle waves on the distant sea came singing past, mingled with scented winds, which had been sleeping through the day amid the orange groves and blossoms, and the moon, like a crescent of diamonds, showered a flood of serene and beautiful glory over the earth. But still Mary could not slumber or rest. A costly robe of crimson, confined around the waist by a girdle inwrought with precious stones, fell in rich folds around her voluptuous form, and the long black braids of hair, which, when unconfined, swept the floor as she stood, were gathered up in plaits and curls, and secured by bodies of gold and strings of rubies and pearls. Her arms, bared almost to the shoulders, were entwined with links of precious stones and silver, and as she paced with a rapid step to and fro the apartment, the constant glitter of her feet displayed a costly taste in sandals, which were embroidered with tiny pearls and gems, and fastened by clasps of heavy polished silver. She looked out on the heavens, peaceful and bright in their glory of azure and silver, then scanned with a restless eye the calm landscape below. All were at rest. The very dogs had ceased baying at the moon, and were slumbering quietly in their chains. She turned and gazed round her apartment. The singing birds were sleeping with their glossy heads behind their wings, undisturbed by the fountain which bubbled from the marble laver and trickled down its sides with a ringing sound. Addie, the beautiful one, was dreaming of Zimri, for there was a tear stealing over the roses of her smiling cheek. Nowhere that she turned could Mary see or hear aught to still the agonies which tore her heart. She snatched her harp and commenced many soothing melodies, but her fingers trembled, and her hand fell along the chords and crushed the music. It was thrown aside, and, crossing her arms over her bosom, she lifted her pallid face, and, closing her eyes as if to shut out every object which had grown familiar, sat like some breathless statue, awaiting the touch of Promethean fires to start it into life. But soon her breast began to heave, and her white teeth were pressed on her lips until the red blood gushed from beneath them. She threw her arms on high, and with a cry of anguish cast herself on her knees in all the despairing sorrow of a repentance like hers. She tore from her hair the gems which fell like a shower of glory around her, and trampled beneath her feet the casket of precious jewelry, until the floor was strewed with its rich contents, and sprinkled ashes on her head, and wept tears such as never had welled up from her heart before. Addie, who had been awakened by the unrestrained grief of her mistress, ran and knelt at her feet, and clasped her knees, and, comprehending well from her expressions the cause of her woe, exclaimed, Go to him who raised the dead! And wherefore, O maiden, should I, the sinful, go to him? O lady, if the sleeper in the valley of death heareth his voice, thy spirit can hear it, and to hear it is to love. The mild and consoling words of Addie, as she told of what she had seen and heard at the raising of the widow's son, and of what the disciples preached daily, soothed Mary's troubled spirit, and something like hope of eventual peace sprung up in her heart, and she laid her head on the bosom of her handmaiden, who clasped her beauteous arms around her, and laid her cool, innocent cheek on the burning, throbbing brow of Mary. And thus the two sat, one breathing hopes of forgiveness, the other listening as if life hung on each word, until day began to dawn behind the blue hills. On that day, when the Master sat at meat with Simon, a rich and learned Pharisee of Nain, a woman came and knelt at his feet, and, bending her veiled head low to the floor, watered them with her tears, and, unbinding her hair, wiped them with the heavy shining curls, then kissed them and anointed them with ointment, the perfumes of which filled the vast room. And he knew that she was a sinner who thus humbly and silently asked for pardon, and said, Thy sins, which are many, are forgiven thee. Thy faith has saved thee. Go in peace. Mary Magdalene was no more seen in Nain. After kneeling at the Saviour's feet and hearing his assurance of forgiveness, she sold her gold and silver and gems and gave much goods to the poor. She was no more seen in Nain in the flashing glory of her beauty, but went forth alone into the wilderness, and in the solemn solitude of its silence, raised an altar to him who had forgiven her sins. End of Section 7. Read by Tad Davis. June 12th, 2021.
Section 8 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 8. Joke. Themistocles had a son who was the darling of his mother. "This little fellow," said Themistocles, "is the sovereign of all Greece." "How so?" said the friend. "Why, he governs his mother governs me. I govern the Athenians, and the Athenians govern all Greece." End of Section 8.
Section 9 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 9. Bonaparte's First Victory. From Everett's Lectures of the French Revolution. The first decisive exhibition of that force of character and prodigious military talent which enabled this person, the most remarkable that had ever appeared in active life, to determine for many years the destinies of the civilized world, was made at Paris on the 5th of October, 1795, in defence of the Convention against an armed insurrection of sections or wards of the capital. After the fall of Robespierre, the party which had brought it about, and which consisted, as I have remarked, of men not much better than himself, were led by the reaction of public feeling to pursue a rather more moderate course. The form of government under which the horrors of the Reign of Terror had been perpetrated had become odious, and it was determined to establish another, the particular arrangements of which, as of all the ephemeral constitutions that so rapidly succeeded each other at this period, are too unimportant to require a recapitulation. But in carrying these arrangements into effect, the members of the Convention, for the purpose of perpetuating their own power, decided that 2/3 of the principal legislative assembly, which was to act under the new constitution, should consist of persons to be chosen by them from their own body. This act, sufficiently exceptionable in its own nature, was rendered still more so by the odium which naturally attached itself to all the members of the Convention who had been either actively or passively concerned in the sanguinary scenes that had just terminated. Every extensive feeling of discontent with the conduct of political affairs regularly manifested itself at this disturbed period in the form of open insurrection. On the day that I have just mentioned, the National Guard of Paris actually assembled in arms to the number of 30,000 men, but without artillery, and marched upon the Tuileries for the purpose of overpowering the government which had been organized under the new constitution, and which was then in session at the palace. It is proper, gentlemen, to remark that although the ostensible and one of the real objects of this movement was to get rid of the obnoxious Convention, it is also known that it was the intention of the leaders, had they succeeded, to restore the monarchy in the person of the Bourbons. The government relied for their defence upon a regular army of about 5,000 men, provided with 200 pieces of artillery, in which consisted their principal advantage. After having successively made trial of 2 or 3 persons to command this little force who proved inadequate to the trust, they had, fortunately for them, before the day of the decisive action, cast their eyes upon a young Corsican officer of about 25 years of age, who had attained the rank of Brigadier General, but had been withdrawn from active service on account of his real or supposed connection with the party of Robespierre, and was now at Paris without employment and in very narrow and embarrassed circumstances. This officer was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was then wholly undistinguished from the crowd of brigadier generals, but had accidentally made himself known by his conduct at the siege of Toulon by the English to Barras, one of the chiefs of the new government, who had been present there, and who now recommended him to his colleagues as a little Corsican who would not stand upon ceremony. The suggestion was adopted, and it is easy to concede that the future conqueror of Marengo and Austerlitz, with 200 pieces of artillery at his disposal, found no great difficulty in dispersing the militia of Paris. A battle of 1 hour's length decided the quarrel, and with it the fortunes of Europe, for had the insurrection succeeded, the monarchy would have been restored. Bonaparte would have lost his position in the army, and the course of subsequent events must have been entirely different. His easy and brilliant success on this occasion recommended him, of course, to immediate promotion. He was forthwith appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, shortly after exchanged this command for that of the Army of Italy, and in the spring of 1796 departed from Paris to enter upon that astonishing campaign from which he returned the virtual master of his country and a great part of Europe. End of section 9. Recording by Alan Mapstone.
Section 10 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sonia. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 10. The Death Watch, by T. Hood. In the free city of Frankfort on the Main, the bodies of the dead are not kept for several days, as with us, in the house of mourning, but are promptly removed to a public cemetery. In order to guard, however, against premature interment, the remains are always retained above ground, until the certain signs of decomposition are apparent. And besides this precaution, in case of suspended animation, the fingers of the corpse are fastened to a bell rope communicating with an alarum, so that on the slightest movement the body rings for the help which it requires for its resuscitation, a watcher and a medical attendant being constantly at hand. Now the duty of answering the life bell had devolved on one Peter Klopp. No very onerous service, considering that for 30 years he had been the official death watch. The metallic tongue of the alarum had never sounded a single note. The defunct Frankforters committed to his charge had remained, one and all, man, woman, and child, as silent as so many stocks and stones. Not that in every case the vital principle was necessarily extinct. In some bodies, out of so many thousands, it doubtless lingered like a spark among the ashes, but disinclined, by national phlegm, to any active assertion of its existence. For a German, indeed, there is a charm in a certain vaporous, dreamy state, between life and death, between sleeping and waking, which a transcendental spirit would not willingly dissolve. But be that as it might, the deceased Frankforters all lay in their turn in the corpse-chamber as passive as statues in marble. Not a limb stirred, not a muscle twitched, not a finger contracted, and consequently not a note sounded to startle the ear or to try the nerves of Peter Klopp. In fine, he became a confirmed sceptic as to such resuscitations. The bell had never rung, and he felt certain that it never would ring, unless from the vibrations of an earthquake. No, death and the doctors did their work too surely for their patients to relapse into life in any such manner. And truly it is curious to observe that, in proportion to the multiplication of physicians and the progress of medical science, the number of revivals has decreased. The inanimate no longer rally as they used to do some centuries since, when Alois Schneider was restored by the jolting of his coffin, and Margaret Schorning, leaving her deathbed, walked down to supper in her last linen. So reasoned Peter Klopp, who, long past the first remorse and fancies of his novitiate, had come, by dint of custom, to look at the bodies in his care but as so many logs or bales of goods committed to the temporary care of a Plutonian warehouseman or Lethean wranger. But he was doomed to be signally undeceived. In the month of September, just after the autumnal Frankfort fair, Martin Grab, a middle-aged man of plethoric habit, after dining heartily on soup, sauerkraut, veal cutlets with bullace sauce, carp in wine jelly, blood sausages, wild boar brawn, herring salad, sweet pudding, Leipzig larks, sour cream with cinnamon, and a bowlful of plums by way of dessert, suddenly dropped down insensible. As he was pronounced to be dead by the doctor, the body was conveyed, as usual, within 12 hours to the public cemetery, where, being deposited in the corpse-chamber, the rest was left to the care and vigilance of the death-watch, Peter Klopp. Accordingly, having taken a last look at his old acquaintance, he carefully twisted the rope of the life-bell around the dead man's fingers, and then retired into his own sanctorum, lighted his pipe, and was soon in that foggy paradise which a true German would not exchange for all the odour of Araby the Blest and the society of the Houris. It was past midnight, and in the corpse-chamber, hung with dismal black, the lifeless body of Martin Grab was lying in its shroud, as still as a marble statue. At its head the solitary funeral lamp burned without a flicker. There was no breath of air to disturb the flame, or to curve the long spider line that hung perpendicularly from the ceiling. The silence was intense. You might have heard the ghost of a whisper, or the whisper of a ghost, if there had been one present to utter it. But the very air seemed dead and stagnant. not elastic enough for a sigh even from a spirit. In the adjoining room reposed the death-watch, Peter Klopp. He had thrown himself in his clothes on his little bed, with his pipe still between his lips. Here, too, all was silent and still. Not a cricket chirped, nor a mouse stirred, nor a draught of air. The light smoke of the pipe mounted directly upward, and mingled with its cloud-like shadows on the ceiling. The eye would have detected the flitting of a moth, the ear would have caught the rustling of a straw, but all was quiet as the grave, still as the steadfast tombs, when suddenly the shrill hurried tone of the alarm-bell, the very same sound that for 15 long years he had nightly listened for, the very same sound that for many long years he had utterly ceased to expect, abruptly startled the slumbering senses of Peter Klopp. In an instant he was out of bed and on his feet, but without the power of further progress. His terror was extreme. To be waked suddenly in a fright is sufficiently dreadful, but to be roused in the dead of the night by so awful a summons, by a call, as it were, from beyond the grave, to help the invisible spirit, perhaps a demon's, to reanimate a cold, clammy corpse, what wonder that the poor wretch stood shuddering, choking, gasping for breath, with his hair standing upright on his head, his eyes starting out of their orbits, his teeth chattering, his hands clutched, his limbs paralyzed, and a cold sweat oozing out from every pore of his body. In the first spasm of horror his jaws had collapsed with such force that he had bitten through the stem of his pipe, the bowl and stalk falling to the floor, while the mouthpiece passed into his throat and agitated him with new convulsions. In the very crisis of his struggles a loud crash resounded from the corpse-chamber. Then came a rattling noise as of loose boards, followed by a stifled cry. Then a strange, unearthly shout, which the death-watch answered with as unnatural a shriek, and instantly fell headlong on his face on the floor. Poor fellow! Why, it was enough to kill him. It did. The noise alarmed the resident doctor and the military patrol, who rushed into the building, and lo! a strange and horrid sight. There lay on the ground the unfortunate death-watch, stiff and insensible, while the late corpse, in its grave-clothes, bent over him, eagerly administering the stimulants and applying the restoratives that had been prepared against his own revival. But all human help was in vain. Peter Klopp was no more, whereas Martin Grab was alive, and actually stepping into the dead man's shoes, became, and is at this day, the official death-watch at Frankfurt on the Main. End of section 10.
Section 11 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 11. Jefferson's Personal Habits, Health, etc. Whatever difference of opinion may exist as to the political principles and moral worth of Mr. Jefferson, and they have been bitter enough in their day, and long continued, the world has accorded to him a high rank among the wise and philosophical minds of the age in which he lived. It is interesting to look back upon the personal habits of such a man and observe the hints he has left that have a bearing which deeply concerns us all, a healthy state of the body. It seems that Mr. Jefferson was neither a Grahamite nor a teetotaler, but still in his day he made a very considerable approach to both of these systems. The following letter happening to be before us, we throw it into the Rover. Monticello, March 21, 1819. Sir, your letter of February 18th came to hand on the 1st instant, and the request for a history of my physical habits would have puzzled me not a little, had it not been for the model with which you accompanied it of Dr. Rush's answer to a similar inquiry. I live so much like other people that I might refer to ordinary life as the history of my own. Like my friend the doctor, I've lived temperately, eating little animal food, and that not as aliment so much as a condiment for the vegetables which constitute my principal diet. I double, however, the doctor's glass and a half of wine, and even treble it with a friend, but have its effects by drinking the weak wines only. The ardent wines I cannot drink, nor do I use ardent spirits of any kind. Malt liquors and cider are my table drinks, and my breakfast, like that also of my friend, is of tea and coffee. I've been blessed with organs of digestion which accept and concoct, without ever murmuring, whatever the palate chooses to consign to them, and I have not yet lost a tooth by age. I was a hard student until I entered on the business of life, the duties of which leave no idle time to those disposed to fill them. And now, retired, and at the age of 76, I am again a hard student. Indeed, my fondness for reading and study revolts me from the drudgery of letter writing, and a stiff wrist, the consequence of an early dislocation, makes writing slow and painful. I'm not so regular in my sleep as the doctor says he was, devoting to it from 5 to 8 hours, according as my company or the book I am reading interests me, and I never go to bed without an hour or a half hour's previous reading of something moral, whereon to ruminate in the intervals of sleep. But whether I retire to bed early or late, I rise with the sun. I use spectacles at night, but not necessary in the day, unless reading small print. My hearing is distinct in particular conversation, but confused when several voices cross each other, which unfits me for the society of the table. I have been more fortunate than my friend in the article of health, so free from catarrhs that I have not had one, in the breast I mean, on an average of 8 or 10 years through life. I ascribe this exemption partly to the habit of bathing my feet in cold water every morning for 60 years past. A fever of more than 24 hours I have not had more than 2 or 3 times in my life. A periodical headache has afflicted me occasionally, once perhaps in 6 or 8 years, for 2 or 3 weeks at a time, which seems now to have left me, and except on an occasion of late indisposition, I enjoy good health, too feeble indeed to walk much, but riding without fatigue 6 or 8 miles a day, and sometimes 30 or 40. I may end these egotisms, therefore, as I began, by saying that my life has been so much like that of other people that I might say with Horace to every one, mutato nomine de tu fabula narratur. I must not end, however, without due thanks for the kind sentiments of regard you are so good as to express toward myself, and with my acknowledgments for these be pleased to accept the assurances of my respect and esteem. T. Jefferson. End of section 11.
Section 12 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 12. The Idiot. The heart, in many instances, is a better judge even of propriety in manners than the judgment. The judgment, in cases touching the conduct of individuals, is perhaps often too severe. For example, we are apt to regard with equal contempt the behavior of the weak and the silly, without considering that under the zero of reason there are many degrees before the human intelligence sinks to that of the animal instincts. At least it is charitable to believe so, and it cherishes amiable sentiments to inculcate that doctrine. Every reader of dramatic history has heard of Garrick's contest with Madame Clarion, and the triumph which the English Rochus achieved over the Siddons of the French stage, by his representation of the father struck with fatuity on beholding his only infant child dashed to pieces by leaping in its joy from his arms. Perhaps the sole remaining conquest for histrionic tragedy is somewhere in the unexplored regions of the mind, below the ordinary understanding, amid the gradations of idiocy. The various shades and degrees of sense and sensibility which lie there unknown, genius, in some gifted moment, may discover. In the meantime, as a small specimen of its undivulged dramatic treasures, we submit to our readers the following little anecdote. A poor widow who kept a booth or stall of apples and sweetmeats had an idiot child so utterly helpless and dependent that he did not appear to be ever alive to anger or self-defense. He sat all day at her feet, and seemed to be possessed of no other sentiment of the human kind than confidence in his mother's love, and a dread of the schoolboys, by whom he was often annoyed. His whole occupation, as he sat on the ground, was in swinging backward and forward, singing "Palal" in a low, pathetic voice, only interrupted at intervals on the appearance of any of his tormentors, when he clung to his mother in alarm. From morning to evening he sung his plaintive and aimless ditty. At night, when his poor mother gathered up her little wares to return home, so deplorable did his defects appear, that while she carried her table on her head, and her stock of little merchandise with one hand, she was obliged to lead him with the other. Ever and anon, as any of the schoolboys appeared in view, the harmless thing clung close to her, and hid his face in her bosom for protection. A human creature so far below the standard of humanity was nowhere ever seen. He had not even the shallow cunning which is often found among these unfinished beings, and his simplicity could not even be measured by the standard we apply to the capacity of a lamb. Yet it had a feeling rarely manifested even in the affectionate dog, and a knowledge never shown by any mere animal. He was sensible of his mother's kindness, and how much he owed to her care. At night, when he spread his humble pallet, though he knew not prayer, nor could comprehend the solemnities of worship, he prostrated himself at her feet, and he kissed them, mumbled a kind of mental orison, as if in fond and holy devotion. In the morning, before she went abroad to resume her station in the marketplace, he peeped anxiously out to reconnoiter the street, and so often as he saw any of the schoolboys in the way, he held her firmly back, and sang his sorrowful Palal. One day, the poor woman and her idiot boy were missed from the marketplace, and the charity of some of the neighbors induced them to visit her hovel. They found her dead on her sorry couch, and the boy sitting beside her, holding her hand, swinging and singing his pitiful lay more sorrowful than he had ever done before. He could not speak, but only utter a brutish gabble. Sometimes he looked as if he comprehended something of what was said. On this occasion, when the neighbors spoke to him, he looked up with the tear in his eye, and clasping the cold hand more tenderly, sunk the strain of his mournful Palal into a softer and sadder key. The spectators, deeply affected, raised him from the body, and he surrendered his hold of the earthly hand without resistance, retiring in silence to an obscure corner of the room. One of them, looking toward the others, said to them, "Poor wretch, what shall we do with him?" At that moment he resumed his chant, and, lifting 2 handfuls of dust from the floor, sprinkled it on his head, and sung with a wild and clear heart-piercing pathos, "Palal, Palal." End of section 12.
Section 13 of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16, edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 13, Lafayette and the Indian Girl Mary. One of the most beautiful and touching incidents connected with the visit of Lafayette to this country 18 years ago was his meeting with a certain Indian woman in Illinois. What a romantic picture the whole life of that wonderful man presents! It is a grand, a sublime poem, an epic of the highest order. See the young Marquis at 19 years of age, taking his life in his hand, embarking in his own ship, crossing the wide ocean to draw his sword in the cause of a strange people, of another tongue, an infant nation struggling for freedom from bondage and warring for the great, the inalienable rights of mankind. See him shed his blood and pour out the treasures of his ample fortune like water to sustain that righteous and long doubtful contest. See him at last with his fellow laborers, successful in their great work. A nation is born and takes a high and honorable rank among the nations of the earth, and the youthful hero returns to the bosom of his own land to watch over its changing destinies and throw his influence into the great cause of human rights and the general amelioration of his race. See him again nearly half a century afterward, when the young people he had helped to emancipate had grown up like magic into a great and powerful nation, again in his old age crossing the ocean to witness with his own eyes the prosperity of his adopted land, and to bless Joseph before he died. On his arrival, see the whole nation rise up as one man to greet his coming and to shower blessings on his venerable head. See him the nation's guest, borne in triumphal cars from city to city, and when he had reached the far west, or what was at that day almost the borders of civilization, behold, an Indian woman cometh out of the wilderness desiring to speak to him. At the interview she draws from her bosom a letter, a choice relic carefully preserved, and presents to the distinguished stranger. He opens it and finds a letter in his own hand with his own signature, written by him 50 years before to a warrior of one of the western tribes who had done valuable service to the American cause in the fearful struggle of the Revolution. That warrior was the father of this woman. He had preserved the letter as the apple of his eye till his dying day, and then bequeathed it as a rich legacy to his daughter. This interesting meeting between Lafayette and the Indian woman took place at Kaskaskia, Illinois, and the whole story was given in detail as follows by Levasseur, the secretary of Lafayette, during his tour through the United States. I was still among the Indians, questioning the hunter as to the situation and force of their tribes, which civilization is rapidly diminishing, when I saw the secretary of the governor of Louisiana, Mr. Kerr, approach, who came to propose that I should go with him to visit an Indian encampment at a very short distance from the village. I consented, and we set off immediately in order to return by the dinner hour. Leaving Kaskaskia, we crossed a river of the same name on a wooden bridge, solidly built and firmly connected. We then marched about 20 minutes on the plain to the entrance of a forest, which we penetrated by a straight path traced along a rivulet. As we advanced, the ground suddenly elevated itself to the right and left, and we quickly found ourselves in a kind of pass, formed by a succession of small hills covered with thickets. After about a quarter of an hour's walk, we arrived at a fence which we climbed, and behind which 2 horses attracted our attention by the noise of the bells hung round their necks. A little further on, the pass enlarging formed a delightful little valley, in the middle of which some huts of bark were raised in a half circle. This was the Indian camp we sought. The openings of these huts were all toward the center of the circle, and the planks, elevated about 3 feet from the ground, were slightly inclined like the cover of a bed. With the exception of a very old woman cooking at a fire in the open air, we found no person in the camp. Either from spite or because she neither comprehended French or English, this woman would reply to none of our questions, and saw us, with the greatest indifference, look at and even handle all the objects which attracted our curiosity in the huts. All was arranged with sufficient order, and it was easy to recognize the places occupied by the women by the little utensils of the toilet, such as looking-glasses, pins, bags of paint, etc., which we remarked there. After a minute examination of this little camp, we were about to leave it, when I was arrested on the border of the streamlet which ran through it by the side of a small mill wheel, which appeared to have been thrown on the bank by the rapidity of the current. I took it up and placed it where I thought it had been originally put by the children, on 2 stones a little above the water, and the current, striking the wings, made it turn rapidly. This puerility, which probably would have passed from my memory if on the same evening it had not placed me before the Indians in a situation sufficiently extraordinary, greatly excited the attention of the old woman, who by her gestures expressed to us a lively satisfaction. On returning to Kaskaskia, we found M. de Sion, an amiable young Frenchman of much intelligence, who, on the invitation of General Lafayette, left Washington City with us to visit the Southern and Western States. Like us, he had just made an excursion into the neighborhood, and appeared quite joyous at the discovery he had made. He had met in the midst of the forest, at the head of a troop of Indians, a pretty young woman, who spoke French very well, and expressed herself with a grace at which he appeared as much astonished as we were. She had asked him if it was true that Lafayette was at Kaskaskia, and on his replying affirmatively, she manifested a great desire to see him. "I always carry with me," said she to M. de Sion, "a relic that is very dear to me. I would wish to show it to him. It will prove to him that his name is not less venerated in the midst of our tribes than among the white Americans for whom he fought." And in speaking thus, she drew from her bosom a little pouch, which enclosed a letter carefully wrapped in several pieces of paper. "It is from Lafayette," said she. "He wrote it to my father a long time since, and my father, when he died, left it to me as the most precious thing he possessed." At the sight of this letter, M. de Sion proposed to the Indian girl to go with him to Kaskaskia, assuring her that General Lafayette would be very much pleased to see her. But this proposition seemed to embarrass her, and under various pretexts she refused to come. However, she added, "If you have anything to say to me this evening, you will find me in my camp, which is close by the village. Anyone can direct you the way, for I am well known at Kaskaskia. My name is Mary." This recital of M. de Sion excited my curiosity keenly, and I would have willingly returned with him immediately to search for Mary. But at this moment a member of the committee of Kaskaskia came to inform me that they were about to sit down to dinner, and we saw General Lafayette going out of Colonel Edgar's, escorted by many citizens, and crossing to Colonel Sweet's house, where we were to dine. We joined the procession and took our places at table, where the general was seated under the canopy of flowers prepared by the ladies of Kaskaskia with much skill and taste, and which produced by the blending of the richest and most lively colors the effect of a rainbow. I spoke to General Lafayette of the meeting with the young Indian girl, and from the desire he manifested to see her, I left the table with M. de Sion at the moment when the company began to exchange patriotic toasts, and we sought a guide to Mary's camp. Chance assisted wonderfully in directing us to an Indian of the same tribe that we wished to visit. Conducted by him, we crossed the bridge of Kaskaskia, and notwithstanding the darkness, soon recognized the path and rivulet I had seen in the morning with Mr. Care. When we were about to enter the enclosure, we were arrested by the fierce barking of 2 stout dogs, which sprang at and would probably have bitten us but for the timely interference of our guide. We arrived at the middle of the camp, which was lighted by a large fire, around which a dozen Indians were squatted, preparing their supper. They received us with cordiality, and as soon as they were informed of the object of our visit, one of them conducted us to Mary's hut, whom we found sleeping on a bison skin. At the voice of M. de Sion, which she recognized, she arose and listened attentively to the invitation of General Lafayette to come to Kaskaskia. She seemed quite flattered by it, but said before deciding to accompany us, she wished to mention it to her husband. While she was consulting with him, I heard a piercing cry, and turning round, I saw near me the old woman I found alone in the camp in the morning. She had just recognized me by the light of the fire, and designated me to her companions, who, quitting immediately their occupations, rushed round me in a circle and began to dance with demonstrations of great joy and gratitude. Their tawny and nearly naked bodies, their faces fantastically painted, their expressive gesticulations, the reflection of the fire, which gave a red tinge to all the surrounding objects, everything gave to this scene something of an infernal aspect, and I fancied myself for an instant in the midst of demons. Mary, witnessing my embarrassment, put an end to it by ordering the dance to cease, and then explained to me the honours which they had just rendered me. When we wish to know if any enterprise we meditate will be happy, we place in a rivulet a small wheel slightly supported on 2 stones. If the wheel turns during 3 suns without being thrown down, the augury is favorable, but if the current carry it away and throws it upon the bank, it is certain proof that our project is not approved by the Great Spirit, unless, however, a stranger comes to replace the little wheel before the end of the 3rd day. You are the stranger who have restored our Manitou and our hopes, and this is your title to be thus celebrated among us." In pronouncing these last words, an ironical smile played on her lips, which caused me to doubt her faith in the Manitou. "You do not appear to be very much convinced," said I to her, "of the efficacy of the service which I have rendered you in raising the Manitou." "I have been taught," said she, "to place my confidence higher. All my hopes are in the God I have been taught to believe in, the God of the Christians." I had at first been much astonished to hear an Indian woman speak French so well, and I was not less so in learning that she was a Christian. Mary perceived it, and to put an end to my surprise, she related to me her history, while her husband and those who were to accompany her to Kaskaskia hastily took their supper of maize cooked in milk. She informed me that her father, who was a chief of one of the nations who inhabited the shores of the Great Lakes of the North, had formerly fought with 100 of his followers under the orders of Lafayette, when the latter commanded an army on the frontiers; that he had acquired much glory and gained the friendship of the Americans. A long time after, that is, about 20 years ago, he left the shores of the Great Lakes with some of his warriors, his wife and daughter, and after having marched a long time, he established himself on the shores of the river Illinois. I was very young then, but have not yet, however, forgotten the horrible sufferings we endured during this long journey, made in a rigorous winter across a country peopled by nations with whom we were unacquainted. They were such that my poor mother, who nearly always carried me on her shoulders, already well loaded with baggage, died under them some days after our arrival. My father placed me under the care of another woman, who also emigrated with us, and occupied himself in securing the tranquil possession of the lands on which he had come to establish ourselves by forming alliances with our new neighbors. The Kickapoos were those who received us best, and we soon considered ourselves as forming a part of their nation. The year following, my father was chosen by them, with some from among themselves, to go and regulate some affairs of the nation with the agent of the United States residing here at Kaskaskia. He wished that I should be of the company, for although the Kickapoos had shown themselves very generous and hospitable toward him, he feared that some war might break out in his absence, as he well knew the intrigues of the English to excite the Indians against the Americans. This same apprehension induced him to accede to the request made by the American agent to leave me in his family to be educated with his infant daughter. My father had much esteem for the whites of that great nation for whom he had formerly fought. He never had cause to complain of them, and he who offered to take charge of me inspired him with great confidence by the frankness of his manners, and above all by the fidelity by which he treated affairs of the Indians. He therefore left me, promising to return to see me every year after the great winter's hunt. He came, in fact, several times afterward, and I, notwithstanding the disagreeableness of a sedentary life, grew up answering the expectations of my careful benefactor and his wife. I became attached to their daughter, who grew up with me, and the truths of the Christian religion easily supplanted in my mind the superstition of my fathers, whom I had scarcely known. Yet I confess to you, notwithstanding the influence of religion and civilization on my youthful heart, the impressions of infancy were not entirely effaced. If the pleasure of wandering conducted me into the shady forest, I breathed more freely, and it was with reluctance that I returned home. When in the cool of the evening, seated in the door of my adopted father's habitation, I heard in the distance, through the silence of the night, the piercing voice of the Indians rallying to return to camp. I started with a thrill of joy, and my feeble voice imitated the voice of the savage with a facility that affrighted my young companion. And when occasionally some warriors came to consult my benefactor in regard to their treaties, or hunters to offer him a part of the produce of their chase, I was always the first to run to meet and welcome them. I testified my joy to them by every imaginable means, and I could not avoid admiring and wishing for their simple ornaments, which appeared to me far preferable to the brilliant decorations of the whites. In the meanwhile, for 5 years, my father had not appeared at the period of the return from the winter's hunting, but a warrior whom I had often seen with him came and found me one evening at the entrance of the forest, and said to me, "Mary, thy father is old and feeble. He has been unable to follow us here, but he wishes to see thee once more before he dies, and he has charged me to conduct thee to him." In saying these words he forcibly took my hand and dragged me with him. I had not even time to reply to him, or even to take any resolution, before we were at a great distance, and I saw well that there was no part left for me but to follow him. We marched nearly all night, and at the dawn of day we arrived at a bark hut built in the middle of a little valley. Here I saw my father, his eyes turned toward the just rising sun. His face was painted as for battle. His tomahawk, ornamented with many scalps, was beside him. He was calm and silent as an Indian who awaited death. As soon as he saw me, he drew from a pouch a paper wrapped with care in a very dry skin, and gave it me, requesting that I should preserve it as a most precious thing. "I wish to see thee once more before dying," said he, "and to give thee this paper, which is the most powerful charm, Manitou, which thou canst employ with the whites to interest them in thy favor, for all those to whom I have shown it have manifested toward me a particular attachment. I received it from a great French warrior, whom the English dreaded as much as the Americans loved, and with whom I fought in my youth." After these words my father was silent. Next morning he expired. Skiap Capet, the name of the warrior who came for me, covered the body of my father with the branches of trees, and took me back to my guardian. There Mary suspended her narrative, and presented to me a letter, a little darkened by time, but in good preservation. "Stay," said she to me, smiling, "you see that I have faithfully complied with the charge of my father. I have taken great care of his Manitou." I opened the letter, and recognized the signature and handwriting of General Lafayette. It was dated at headquarters, Albany, June 1778, after the northern campaign, and addressed to Panisquioa, an Indian chief of one of the Six Nations, to thank him for the courageous manner in which he had served the American cause. "Well," said Mary, "now that you know me well enough to introduce me to General Lafayette, shall we go to him, that I may also greet him, whom my father revered as the courageous warrior and the friend of our nations?" "Willingly," I replied, "but it seems to me that you have promised to inform us in what manner, after having tasted for some time the sweets of civilization, you came to return to the rude and savage life of the Indians." At this question Mary looked downward and seemed troubled. However, after a slight hesitation, she resumed in a lower tone, "After the death of my father, Skiap Capet often returned to see me. We soon became attached to each other. He did not find it difficult to determine me to follow him into the forest, where I became his wife. This resolution at first very much afflicted my benefactors, but when they saw that I found myself happy, they pardoned me, and each year, during all the time that our encampment is established near Kaskaskia, I rarely pass a day without going to see them. If you wish, we can visit them, for their house is close by our way, and you will see by the reception they will give me that they retain their esteem and friendship." Mary pronounced these last words with a degree of pride, which proved to us that she feared that we might have formed a bad opinion of her on account of her flight from the house of her benefactors with Skia Capet. We accepted her proposition, and she gave the signal for departure. At her call, her husband and 8 warriors presented themselves to escort us. Monsieur de Sillon offered her his arm, and we began our march. We were all very well received by the family of Mr. Mesnard, but Mary above all received the most tender marks of affection from the persons of the household. Mr. Mesnard, Mary's adopted father, was at Kaskaskia as one of the committee charged with the reception of Lafayette, and Mrs. Mesnard asked us if we would undertake to conduct her daughter to the ball, which she herself was prevented from attending by indisposition. We assented with pleasure, and while Mary assisted Miss Mesnard to complete her toilet, we seated ourselves round a great fire in the kitchen. Scarcely were we seated when I saw moving in the corner a black mass, of which I had at first a difficulty in recognizing the nature and form, but after an attentive examination I found it was an old negro, doubled by age. His face was so much wrinkled and deformed by time that it was impossible to distinguish in it a single feature, and I guessed the place of his mouth by a little cloud of tobacco smoke which escaped thence from time to time. This man appeared to give great attention to the conversation which took place between us and a young man of Mr. Mesnard's family. When he understood that we travelled with General Lafayette, and that we came from St. Louis, he asked if we had found many Frenchmen there. I replied that we had seen some, and among others Mr. Chateau, the founder of the town. "What?" cried he, with a loud voice, which seemed not to belong to so decrepit a body. "What, you found the little Chateau? Oh, I know him well, so I do, that little Chateau. We have travelled a great deal together on the Mississippi, and that at a time when very few of the whites had come this far. But do you know," said I, "that he whom you call the little Chateau is very old, that he is certainly more than 90 years of age?" "Oh, I believe that well, but what of that? That does not prevent that I should know him well when a child." "Of what age are you then?" "Of that I know nothing, as they never taught me to count. All that I know is, that I left New Orleans with my master, who made part of the expedition sent by the Navigation Company of the Mississippi, under the orders of the young Chateau, to go and build a fort high up the river. Young Chateau was hardly 17, but he was commander of the expedition, because his father was, they said, one of the richest proprietors of the company. After having rowed a long time against the current, and suffered great fatigue, we arrived at last not far from here, where we set about building Fort Chartres. It seems as if I was now there. I see from here the great stones which bore the great arches we built. Every one of us said, 'Here is a fort will last longer than us all, and longer than our children.' I also believed it well, and yet I have seen the last of it, for it is now in ruins, and I am yet living. Do you know, sir, how many years it is since we built Fort Chartres? At least 80 years, if I am not deceived. Will count, and you will know very nearly my age. I was then at least 30 years old, for my little Chaton appeared to me a child. I have already served 3 masters, and I have suffered a great deal. According to that account, you are 110 years old, Daddy Francis. Yes, indeed, I believe I am at least that, for it is a long time that I have labored and suffered." "How," said the young man who was seated near him, "do you suffer now, Francis?" "Oh, pardon me, sir, I speak not of the time I have lived in this house. Since I belong to Mr. Mesnard, it is very different. I am now happy. Instead of serving others, they all serve me. Mr. Mesnard will not even allow me to go and bring in a little wood for the fire. He says that I am too old for that. But I must tell the truth. Mr. Mesnard is not a master to me. He is a man. He is a friend." The homage of the old slave rendered to the humanity of his master gave us a high idea of the character of Mr. Mesnard. While we were yet listening to old Francis, Mary and Miss Mesnard came to inform us that they were ready, and asked us if we would be on our way, as it began to grow late. We took leave of Mrs. Mesnard, and found our Indian escort, who had waited patiently for us at the door, and who resumed their position near us at some distance in front, to guide and protect our march, as if we had been crossing an enemy's country. The night was quite dark, but the temperature was mild, and the fireflies illuminated the atmosphere around us. Monsieur de Sion conducted Miss Mesnard, and I gave my arm to Mary, who, notwithstanding the darkness, walked with a confidence and lightness which only a forest life could produce. The fireflies attracted and interested me much, for although this was not the first time I had observed them, I had never before seen them in such numbers. I asked Mary if these insects, which from their appearance seemed so likely to astonish the imagination, had never given place among the Indians to popular beliefs or tales. "Not among the nations of these countries, where every year we are familiarized with their great numbers," said she to me, "but I have heard that among the tribes of the north they commonly believe that they are the souls of departed friends, who return to console them or demand the performance of some promise. I even know several ballads on this subject. One of them appears to have been made a long time since in a nation which lives farther north and no longer exists. It is by songs that great events and popular traditions are ordinarily preserved among us, and this ballad, which I have often heard sung by the young girls of our tribe, leaves no doubt as to the belief of some Indians concerning the firefly. I asked her to sing me this song, which she did with much grace. Although I did not comprehend the words, which were Indian, I observed a great harmony in their arrangement, and in the very simple music in which they were sung, an expression of deep melancholy. When she had finished the ballad, I asked her if she could not translate it for me into French, so that I might comprehend the sense. With difficulty, she said, for I have always found great obstacles to translating exactly the expressions of our Indians into French when I have served them as interpreter with the whites, but I will try, and she translated nearly as follows. The rude season of the chase was over. Antakya, the handsomest, the most skillful, and bravest of the Cherokee warriors, came to the banks of the Avalachi, where he was expected by Manahela, the young virgin promised to his love and bravery. The first day of the moon of flowers was to witness their union. Already had the two families assembled round the same fire, given their assent. Already had the young men and women prepared and ornamented the new cabin, which was to receive the happy couple, when at the rising of the sun, a terrible cry, the cry of war, sent forth by the scout, who always watches at the summit of the hill, called the old men to the council, and the warriors to arms. The whites appeared on the frontier. Murder and robbery accompanied them. The star of fertility had not reached its noontide height, and already Antakya had departed at the head of his warriors to repel robbery, murder, and the whites. Go, said Manahela to him, endeavoring to stifle her grief, go fight the cruel whites, and I will pray to the Great Spirit to wrap thee with a cloud proof against their blows. I will pray him to bring thee back to the banks of the Avalachi, there to be loved by Manahela. I will return to thee, replied Antakya. I will return to thee. My arrows have never disappointed my aim. My tomahawk shall be bathed in the blood of the whites. I will bring back their scalps to ornament the door of thy cabin. Then I shall be worthy of Manahela. Then shall we love in peace. Then shall we be happy. The first day of the moon of flowers had brightly dawned, and many more had passed away, and none had heard from Antakya and his warriors. Stooping on the shores of the Avalachi, the mournful Manahela every evening raised to the evil spirits little pyramids of polished pebbles, to appease their anger and to avert their resistance to her well-beloved. But the evil spirits were inflexible, and their violent blasts overthrew the little pyramids. One evening of the last moon of flowers, Manahela met on the banks of the river a pale and bloody warrior. Die, poor ivy, said he to Manahela, die, the noblest oak of the forest, that proud oak under whose shade thou hoped to enjoy repose and happiness, is fallen. It has fallen under the redoubled strokes of the whites. In its fall it has crushed those who felled it, but it is fallen. Die, poor ivy, die, for the oak which was to give thee support is fallen. 2 days after, Manahela was no more. Antakya, whose courage had been deceived by fate, had fallen covered with wounds into the hands of the whites, who carried him far away. But he escaped, and after wandering long through the forest, he returned to mourn his defeat and meditate vengeance with Manahela. When he arrived, she was no more. Agitated by the most violent despair, he ran in the evening to the banks of the Avalachi, calling Manahela, but the echo alone replied to the accents of his grief. O Manahela, he exclaimed, if my arrows have disappointed my skill, if my tomahawk has not spilt the blood of the whites, if I have not brought thee their scalps to ornament the door of thy cabin, forgive me. It is not the fault of my courage. The evil spirits have fought against me, and yet I have suffered no complaint to escape me, not a sigh when the iron of my enemies tore my breast. I have not abased myself by asking my life. They preserved it against my will, and I am only consoled by the hope of one day avenging myself and offering thee many of their scalps. O Manahela, come, if but to tell me that thou pardonest me, and that thou permittest me to follow thee into the world of the Great Spirit. At the same instant a vivid light, pure and lambent, appeared to the eyes of the unfortunate Antakya. He saw in it the soul of his beloved, and followed it through the valley during all the night, supplicating it to stay and to pardon him. At the dawn of the day he found himself on the border of a great lake. The light had disappeared, and he believed that it had passed over the water. Immediately, although feeble and fatigued, he made a canoe of the trunk of a tree which he hollowed, and with a branch he made a paddle. At the end of the day his work was achieved. With the darkness the deceptive light returned, and during all the night Anticyra pursued the delusion on the face of the unsteady waters. But it again disappeared before the light of the sun, and with it vanished the slight breath of hope and the life of Anticyra. Mary ended her ballad, and I expressed to her my thanks as we arrived at the bridge of Kaskaskia. There Skiakape collected his escort, said a few words to his wife, and left us to enter the village alone. We approached the house of Mr. Morrison, at which the ball was given to General Lafayette. I then felt that Mary trembled. Her trouble was so great that she could not conceal it from me. I asked her the cause. "If you would spare me a great mortification," she said, "you will not conduct me among the ladies of Kaskaskia. They are now, without doubt, in their most brilliant dresses, and the coarseness of my clothes will inspire them with contempt and pity, two sentiments which will equally affect me. Besides, I know that they blame me for having renounced the life of the whites, and I feel little at ease in their presence." I promised what she desired, and she became reassured. Arrived at Mr. Morrison's, I conducted her into a lower chamber, and went to the hall to inform General Lafayette that the young Indian girl awaited him below. He hastened down, and several of the committee with him. He saw and heard Mary with pleasure, and could not conceal his emotion on recognizing his letter, and observing with what holy veneration it had been preserved during nearly half a century in a savage nation, among whom he had not even supposed his name had ever penetrated. On her part, the daughter of Panaskawia expressed with vivacity the happiness she enjoyed in seeing him, along with whom her father had the honor to fight for the good American cause. After a half-hour's conversation, in which General Lafayette was pleased to relate the evidences of the fidelity and courageous conduct of some Indian nations toward Americans during the Revolutionary War, Mary manifested a wish to retire, and I accompanied her to the bridge, where I replaced her under the care of Skiakape and his escort, and bade them farewell. End of section 13.
Section 14 of The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Faithann Gibson. The Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. Edited by Seba Smith and Lawrence Labree. Section 14. Allegoric Vision by Samuel T. Coleridge. A feeling of sadness, a peculiar melancholy, is wont to take possession of me alike in spring and in autumn. But in spring it is the melancholy of hope. In autumn it is the melancholy of resignation. As I was journeying on foot through the Apennine, I fell in with a pilgrim, in whom the spring and the autumn and the melancholy of both seemed to have combined. In his discourse there were the freshness and the colours of April. Qual ramicella ramo, tal da pensiero in l'ulgia mogliava. But as I gazed on his whole form and figure, I bethought me of the not unlovely decays both of age and of the late season. In the stately elm, after the clusters have been plucked from its entwining vines, and the vines are as bands of dried withies around its trunk and branches. Even so there was a memory on his smooth and ample forehead, which blended with the dedication of his steady eyes that still looked, I know not whether upward, or far onward, or rather to the line of meeting where the sky rests on the distance. But how may I express the dimness of abstraction which lay on the lustre of the pilgrim's eyes, like the flitting tarnish from the breath of a sigh on a silver mirror, and which accorded with their slow and reluctant movement whenever he turned them to any object on the right hand or on the left? It seemed, methought, as if there lay upon the brightness a shadowy presence of disappointments, now unfelt but never forgotten. It was at once the melancholy of hope and of resignation. We had not long been fellow travellers ere a sudden tempest of wind and rain forced us to seek protection in the vaulted doorway of a lone chapelry, and we sat face to face each on the stone bench alongside the low, weather-stained wall, and as close as possible to the massy door. After a pause of silence, "Even thus," said he, "like two strangers that have fled to the same shelter from the same storm, not seldom do despair and hope meet for the first time in the porch of death." "All extremes meet," I answered, "but yours was a strange and visionary thought." "The better then doth it beseem both the place and me," he replied. "From a visionary wilt thou hear a vision? Mark that vivid flash through this torrent of rain, fire and water. Even here thy adage holds true, and its truth is the moral of my vision." I entreated him to proceed. Sloping his face toward the arch and yet averting his eye from it, he seemed to seek and prepare his words, till listening to the wind that echoed within the hollow edifice, and to the rain without, which stole on his thoughts with its twofold sound, the clash hard by and the murmur all round, he gradually sank away, alike from me and from his own purpose, and amid the gloom of the storm, and in the duskiness of that place, he sat like an emblem on a rich man's sepulchre, or like a mourner on the sodded grave of an only one, an aged mourner, who is watching the waned moon and sorroweth not. Starting at length from his brief trance of abstraction, with courtesy and an atoning smile he renewed his discourse, and commenced his parable. During one of those short furlongs from the service of the body, which the soul may sometimes obtain even in this its militant state, I found myself in a vast plain, which I immediately knew to be the valley of life. It possessed an astonishing diversity of soils, and here was a sunny spot and there a dark one, forming just such a mixture of sunshine and shade as we have observed on the mountain-side on an April day, when the thin broken clouds are scattered over heaven. Almost in the very entrance of the valley stood a large and gloomy pile, into which I seemed constrained to enter. Every part of the building was crowded with tawdry ornaments and fantastic deformity. On every window was portrayed, in glaring and inelegant colours, some horrible tale or preternatural incident, so that not a ray of light could enter untinged by the medium through which it passed. The body of the building was full of people, some of them dancing in and out, in unintelligible figures, with strange ceremonies and antic merriment, while others seemed convulsed with horror or pining in mad melancholy. Intermingled with these I observed a number of men, clothed in ceremonial robes, who appeared, now to marshal the various groups and to direct their movements, and now with menacing countenances to drag some reluctant victim to a vast idol, framed of iron bars intercrossed, which formed at the same time an immense cage and the shape of a human colossus. I stood for a while, lost in wonder what these things might mean, when lo, one of the directors came up to me, and with a stern and reproachful look bade me uncover my head, for the place into which I had entered was the temple of the only true religion, in the holier recess of which the great goddess personally resided. Himself too he made me reverence as the consecrated minister of her rites. Awestruck by the name of religion, I bowed before the priest, and humbly and earnestly entreated him to conduct me into her presence. He assented. Offerings he took from me, with mystic sprinklings of water and with salt he purified, and with strange soufflations he exorcised me, and then led me through many dark and winding alleys, the dew-damps of which chilled my flesh, and the hollow echoes under my feet mingled, methought, with moanings, affrighted me. At length we entered a large hall, without window or spiracle or lamp. The asylum and dormitory, it seemed, of perennial light, only that the walls were brought to the eye by a number of self-luminous inscriptions in letters of a pale sepulchral light, that held strange neutrality with the darkness on the verge of which it kept its rayless vigil. I could read them, methought, but though each one of the words taken separately I seemed to understand, yet when I took them in sentences, they were riddles and incomprehensible. As I stood meditating on these hard sayings, my guide thus addressed me. "Read and believe. These are mysteries." At the extremity of the vast hall the goddess was placed. Her features, blended with darkness, rose out to my view, terrible yet vacant. I prostrated myself before her, and then retired with my guide, soul withered and wandering and dissatisfied. As I re-entered the body of the temple, I heard a deep buzz as of discontent. A few whose eyes were bright, and either piercing or steady, and whose ample foreheads, with the weighty bar, ridge-like above the eyebrows, bespoke observation followed by meditative thought, and a much larger number who were engaged by the severity and insolence of the priests in exacting their offerings, had collected in one tumultuous group, and with a confused outcry of This is the temple of superstition! After much contumely and turmoil, and cruel maltreatment on all sides, rushed out of the pile, and I, methought, joined them. We speeded from the temple with hasty steps, and had now nearly gone round half the valley, when we were addressed by a woman, tall beyond the stature of mortals, and with something more than human in her countenance and mien, which yet could by mortals be only felt, not conveyed by words or intelligibly distinguished. Deep reflection, animated by ardent feeling, was displayed in them, and hope, without its uncertainty, and a something more than all these, which I understood not, but which yet seemed to blend all these into a divine unity of expression. Her garments were white and mantly, and of the simplest texture. We inquired her name. "My name," she replied, "is Religion." The more numerous part of our company, affrighted by the very sound, and sore from recent impostures or sorceries, hurried onward and examined no farther. A few of us, struck by the manifest opposition of her form and manners to those of the living idol whom we had so recently abjured, agreed to follow her, though with cautious circumspection. She led us to an eminence in the midst of the valley, from the top of which we could command the whole plain, and observe the relation of the different parts of each of the other, and of each to the whole, and of all to each. She then gave us an optic glass which assisted without contradicting our natural vision, and enabled us to see far beyond the limits of the valley of life, though our eye, even thus assisted, permitted us only to behold a light and a glory, but we could not descry, save only that it was, and that it was most glorious. And now, with the rapid transition of a dream, I had overtaken and rejoined the more numerous party, who had abruptly left us, indignant at the name of religion. They journeyed on, goading each other with remembrances of past oppressions, and never looking back, till, in the eagerness to recede from the temple of superstition, they had rounded the whole circle of the valley. And lo, there faced us the mouth of a vast cavern, at the base of a lofty and almost perpendicular rock, the interior side of which, unknown to them and unsuspected, formed the extreme and backward wall of the temple. An impatient crowd, we entered the vast and dusky cave, which was the only perforation of the precipice. At the mouth of the cave sat two figures. The first, by her dress and gesture, I knew to be Sensuality. The second form, from the fierceness of his demeanour and the brutal scornfulness of his looks, declared himself to be the monster Blasphemy. He uttered big words, yet ever and anon I observed that he turned pale at his own courage. We entered. Some remained in the opening of the cave, with the one or the other of its guardians. The rest, and I among them, pressed on till we reached an ample chamber that seemed the centre of the rock. The climate of the place was unnaturally cold. In the furthest distance of the chamber sat an old dim-eyed man poring with a microscope over the torso of a statue which had neither basis nor feet nor head, but on its breast was carved Nature. To this he continually applied his glass, and seemed enraptured with the various inequalities which it rendered visible on the seemingly polished surface of the marble. Yet evermore was this delight and triumph followed by expressions of hatred and vehement railings against a being who yet, he assured us, had no existence. This mystery suddenly recalled to me what I had read in the holiest recess of the temple of superstition. The old man spoke in divers tongues, and continued to utter other and most strange mysteries. Among the rest, he talked much and vehemently concerning an infinite series of causes and effects, which he explained to be a string of blind men, the last of whom caught hold of the skirt of the one before him, he of the next, and so on till they were all out of sight, and that all walked infallibly straight, without making one false step, though all were alike blind. Methought I borrowed courage from surprise, and asked him, "Who then is at the head to guide them?" He looked at me with ineffable contempt, not unmixed with an angry suspicion, and then replied, "No one." The string of blind men went on forever, without any beginning, for although one blind man could not move without stumbling, yet infinite blindness supplied the want of sight. I burst into laughter, which instantly turned to terror, for as he started forward in rage, I caught a glance of him from behind, and I beheld a monster biform and Janus-headed, in the hinder face and shape of which I instantly recognized the dread countenance of superstition, and in the terror I awoke. End of section 14. Section number 15 of the Rover, Volume 1, number 16. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Gabrielle Rodriguez. The Rover, Volume 1, number 16. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree. Section number 15. Our Table. The engravings of the Rover. Those who chance to see the prospectus of this work at its commencement may recollect that but 2 engravings a year were promised, one for the commencement of each volume. Accidental circumstance at the time soon changed the plan, so far as to lead the publication of beautiful specimens of the arts in each number for several weeks, and the decided favor with which the work was received by the public induced the publishers to persevere and give an elegant finished steel engraving every week the year round. How well they have succeeded! Those who have had an opportunity of seeing the work thus far can judge for themselves. It is not deemed too much to say, however, that a larger or more beautiful collection of engravings than will be comprised in this work, in this course of year, cannot be found elsewhere for the same amount of money. 52 highly finished engravings a year, besides 2 large and elegant volumes of choice reading, original and selected, all for $3 or 6 cents a week. The features of the Rover. 2 features of the Rover. There are 2 features in the plane of this work which we wish our readers to bear in mind. The first is the completeness of the single numbers. Each number, as a general thing, will be perfect in itself, having no necessarily connection with other numbers, past or to come, so that the purchaser of single numbers, besides a beautiful engraving, alone worth 4 times the price of the number, will get several tales, sketches, and poems, original and selected, all for 6 cents. The second feature is the suitableness of the work for binding into handsome volumes. It is intended that the manner of getting up the work, both mechanically and in the matter of its contents, shall render it an attractive and useful book for future reference and present reading. 2 large volumes, containing 832 pages, besides 52 elegant steel engravings for $3, must be considered remarkably cheap, even in these days of cheap literature. American scenery. Among the engravings for the Rover, it is intended, as fast as good ones can be obtained, to give a series representing American scenery in all the different states of the Union. One of the kind have already been presented in our 13th number, giving a view of the ruins at Fort Ticonderoga in this state. The second of the series is given this week from scenery in New Jersey. The plate is a very beautiful and highly finished specimen of the art from an original painting by Duron, engraved by Rolfe. The scene is a quiet landscape, representing evening on the Passaic River. Several correspondents must wait for answers to their communications till next week. In the meantime, we will say to Bossy, not Dr. Johnson's Bossy, nor the boss of Oliver Twist, but our correspondent Bossy, that if he will satisfy us, beyond a reasonable doubt, as the court tells the jury, that he says about certain literary transactions is strictly true, he shall be heard. We also take pleasure in expressing our thanks to the author of The Birth of Aurora, and shall at any time be happy to receive like favors from him. End of Section 15. End of the Rover, Volume 1, Number 16. Edited by Seba Smith and Labree.